Okay, I give in. I will make a making of video. So, as many of you know, my channel here on YouTube is more on the academic side, and my page on Instagram is more on the artistic side. Yet, I get so many questions about how do you make these animations? What prompts do you use for AI? How can I make images like yours? And I do offer consulting services and classes for those inclined to pay, but I can't answer every single message, every single DM on Instagram. So I'm finally making a video explaining how. And let's get started with this making of sequence. So our very first idea here, and this will be like a class, as if you had paid from our first class, for example, will be which techniques to choose for medical depictions for art and education. So the first thing is to decide which technique we are going to use for a specific purpose. For example, drawing permits total freedom in creating images. So if you want to depict a specific surgical image, for example, drawing can be very interesting. Whereas AI is easy to learn and fast to use, but leads to less accurate depictions and can have poor results for specific topics. So, AI tends to be good for art, but not that much for teaching. AI is more beautiful, AI is prettier, but it's less accurate. So, if you are going for a more academic idea, if you are aiming to teach a subject, for example, drawing or painting, may be the superior technique. Whereas, if you want to create something beautiful to spread your art, your vision, your ideas, then AI may be the best choice for you. Painting, for example, also generates appealing visuals, and animations and digital art are great for explaining concepts and have large social media appeal. So let's go through each of them. When you compare the pros and cons between these major techniques, we will mostly be contrasting what's fastest versus what's more accurate, which is pretty much what we saw in drawing versus AI, but this also applies, for example, to animation and digital art. You have a triad and you have to pretty much pick two options. It can be fast to produce, it can be easy to produce, or it can be accurate. So if you want it to be fast and easy to produce, it will most likely not be very accurate. If you want it to be accurate and easy to produce, it will not be fast. And if you want it to be accurate and fast, you better be ready for using some unorthodox approaches, so it won't be easy. Like I said, drawing allows total freedom in creating images. However, it's hard to master, it's laborious and time-consuming, and it's not that attention drawing. I have some examples from my own work, and you can see, for example, that it's great for complex depictions of niche topics. So here I have, for example, a drawing of Epstein's anomaly, and with drawing I can represent it accurately, which is something I could not do, for example, with AI. AI, at least for now, and I'm talking about DALL-E 3 and Midjourney version 7, for example, if you're watching the future, are much quicker and much faster, but they cannot understand specific malformations, for example. DALL-E and Midjourney are not capable of understanding well, for example, anatomical terms such as sclera, rash, tricuspid valve. Try asking DALL-E 3, for example, to create an image of a tricuspid valve. It has a general idea of what a cardiac valve should be. However, it has no idea of what are the specific details of the tricuspid valve. This is a consequence of how AI models are trained. AI models are trained on millions or billions of images, and so they will be more skilled at creating images, based on images they've seen a lot. So if you take a very common topic, for example, a car, it's very easy to find an image of a car on the internet. So DALL-E 3 and Midjourney Versus 7 have quite a lot of ease creating car images. If you ask it to create an image of the circle of wheels, this is something a follower has asked me once, to create an image, an artistic image of the circle of wheels. You can do it by hand, but good luck trying to get DALL-E 3 to understand, or Stable Diffusion for that matter, to understand what the circle of wheels is. Because truth be told, there are not that many images of the circle of wheels on the internet. So it's likely the algorithm, the image generating algorithm, has not been trained as well on that specific topic. The cons of drawing are it's hard to master, laborious and time consuming, and not very attention drawing. The time required is usually, personally I find out, about 2 hours for a decent average image. If you want a sketch that looks pretty good, not necessarily artistic, but enough to convey your concept, it will take me around 2 hours to make it. And it's relatively hard to make. It does require some skill, and it will require quite a lot of training from you before you can create proficient images. Here, another example of a persistent truncus arteriosus, for example, another concept AI cannot understand. Here we have a ventricular septal defect, also an atrial septal defect, and their patent ductus arteriosus. Now I see these images from left to right shunts as a general rule, not just a specific one of them. And here one, for example, from level transposition of the great vessels. And this is what happens when I ask AI to create an image of tricuspid atresia. So you can see that overall it understands what a heart is, what the heart chambers are. You can see here, for example, right ventricle, left ventricle, right atrium, left atrium. It even got the aorta right, although I can see here like 5 pulmonary veins, doesn't seem quite right. But overall the image is quite good. However, it doesn't understand what the characteristics of tricuspid atresia are, and that's pretty easy to deduce why, because there are not that many images of tricuspid atresia on the internet, so the image generation algorithm was not trained on it. That's why I generally use AI for my more artistic purposes on Instagram, and I tend to draw or paint when I'm trying to teach something, particularly a very specific topic. So here we have an example of drawing, which is my head illustration, for example. It took me around 2 hours, I think, somewhat hard to master. I'd say most people could do this with enough practice, but there are some basic concepts such as light and shadow or perspective, for example, that are to some degree technical concepts, are things you would learn at an arts class that would be extremely useful for you when making such an image. Luckily, I was one of the very few people that paid attention to art class when I was in school. So now I get to use a bit of it, even though I'm a medical doctor. And what I said, that drawing is not very attention drawing, is clearly demonstrated here. So here we have an example of a painting, a specific technique of post-produced painting I used, which got, for example, almost 30,000 likes on Instagram. And we have a drawing, that same drawing I mentioned, which got 187 likes. Now, this is of course not an apples to apples comparison, because one is actually both are reels, but they were published on different dates, so maybe my following was a bit large when I published the painting, but this is not an isolated occurrence. I see this a lot on my Instagram, and the fact is that animations or drawings tend to be way more eye-catching than drawing. Drawing is good for illustrating concepts, but not very attention drawing. Here we have an example of painting, and the greatest pro is it has appealing visuals. It draws the attention of the viewer. People tend to click on it and go to see it. It's interesting for people to see. Now, the cons. Like drawing, it's laborious and time-consuming, and it can also be physically tiring. Some things people don't usually think when they watch a video like this, for example, is that I actually had to keep my arm immovable for 2 hours. That means there is no going to the bathroom or grabbing a snack, for example, during the painting. If you go to the bathroom and you basically wash your hands or even use your hands for anything, you ruin the painting. So when you try to draw something, for example, on your arm or on your hand or on your face, you need to plan very well your schedule to make sure you have the 2 or 3 hours necessary to making the painting. And bear in mind, you won't have pauses, for example, for going to the bathroom. There is no way to do it without ruining the painting. So that's the kind of thing you need to keep in mind. Also, it may take quite a few attempts before you can get it right. It's also time consuming and not that much because of the painting, although you may need some attempts before you can get the painting right, so that alone could consume some time. And since you tend to get tired, you tend to get a bit achy from all the standing still, you can also have to divide it between different days. But what takes the greatest amount of time is the post-production. Because one of the greatest reasons some of these videos I make draw a lot of attention is not so much because of the painting, but because of the whole package, including the post-production effects I make, which essentially consist into switching colors to draw attention to the structures I wish to show to the viewers. The skill required, I'd say, is moderate. It's a bit faster to learn and easier to do if you have no experience than just grabbing a pen and drawing. After all, you can at least erase it. You can grab a piece of toilet paper or a cotton net, for example, and just erase the ink. If you are using appropriate ink for the skin, of course, if you try to use some watermarking pen, then maybe you want to reconsider that decision. I started using watermarker pens and eventually I switched onto ink that's proper for the skin. But what takes the most amount of time is the post-production. Here I have some example displaying exactly this, which is the original painting of the hand as I did it in real life, the upper image, and then we have the lower image, which is that same image after post-production. After I went into my software, I've been using DaVinci Resolve Studio 18.6 and, so to speak, do the magic. Go into the color tab, into the fusion tab, and switch the colors into something that's more attention drawing. And the problem with using these programs is that you expect to learn it in 3 months, for example, and to master it in 2 years. It's very hard to start a YouTube channel or an Instagram page and start creating great animations in no time, unless you have some kind of background experience. But a lot of people write me, for example, DM me on Instagram, and ask me, how do you make your heart, your cardiac animations, for example? How did you do those arrhythmia animations? I wish I could do something like that. And the truth is, of course, it can be taught, but it's a skill. It's like asking someone, for example, how do you perform surgery? Well, I can definitely teach you, but it's not going to take one afternoon. it's going to take you a lot of time and dedication, and you'll probably spend months studying it and experimenting with it before you start getting decent results. If you have any doubt about the amount of time or effort it takes to create these animations or these images, or even to do what I'm doing right now and to record it, just go into my older videos and check how they look. And you see that over the past 3 years, things have improved a lot. So I personally do the animations on DaVinci Resolve's Fusion tab, and we can definitely go deeper into my Fusion setup on my nodes setup later, but this would be a video on its own. And that's an interesting point also to raise, that I pretty much learned Fusion through a combination of experimentation, that is self-taught, and watching YouTube videos. I pretty much learned everything I know about video editing and animation making from just typing into YouTube, learn Fusion, and spending a whole week watching the videos. The truth is, if you take 1 week to study a subject and spend 1 full week, like 12 hours a day, watching videos on YouTube, for example, on a specific topic, by the end of the week, you'll know more than 99% of the world population on that topic. Personally, I have a tremendous belief in YouTube's and social media's as a whole ability to teach. I see this as a tremendous tool for teaching for the future generations, and after all, there is a reason I am on this market. I decided to create a company on this. And so, the pros of animations and digital art, which is what we're talking about right now, is it's excellent for explaining concepts, and it also has large social media appeal. So I had quite a lot of success, at least for me. I believe, according to my own metrics, I had quite a lot of success with my cardiac arrhythmias animations and also with my hand animations. And that's in part because animations allow you to explain complex topics in a more simple and understandable way, and also because they are very eye-catching. People like to watch them. To some degree, they are more pleasant to watch than just someone speaking. Because part of the reason I created my channel, part of the reason I started all of this, was because I originally wanted to pursue a career in general surgery in the United States, and I was studying for the steps for the United States medical licensing examination. And one of the things that bothered me is that I watched a lot of courses, for preparatory courses for the steps, and there was so much old school explanation where the professor would just stand there and speak to a camera and draw things on paint with a mouse. And some people actually make it work. It's quite commendable if a professor can teach a complex subject just by speaking, just over audio and drawing on paint. I can only imagine what he could do if he had a supporting staff to allow for greater animations and for a more elaborate way of explaining. But the truth is, as a student, I felt that many courses were sometimes lacking in that I was almost expecting to see an animation displaying the mechanism, and there never was one. Nobody showed the animation. And so eventually I thought, well, maybe I could do the animation. And this is how it all started. So essentially, this whole conversation was just to say that animations are great for explaining complex concepts. And here's another example of how it has a large social media appeal. This is my most successful video ever. I'm not sure if it's successful by entertainment metrics, But for my personal channel, my most successful video ever, and it had more than 20,000 views, for example, in the last 3 years. And it's a very simple video about pneumothorax. Almost all the views came from YouTube search. However, the reason it ranked well is because it's an animation, whereas there are so many other videos that don't show what's happening. And one of the key points I would like to cite regarding the skill required is that animations are hard to invent, hard to create, and easy to replicate. Because once you have your node workflow ready, it's easier to change some small details. So it's much harder to create a perfect workflow that depicts a pneumothorax happening. Yet once you have the left pneumothorax animation, for example, if you want to create a right pneumothorax animation or a double pneumothorax animation, it's all of a sudden much easier, because now all you have to do is tweak some little details in your vast node tree and cause this specific causality to apply to more than one side of the image, for example. And what I mean by this, and I'm not a programmer, I'm a medical doctor, so perhaps my logic explanation is not the best I've ever seen. It's not the best you've ever seen. But the whole idea is that it may take weeks to build the correct structure to generate your animation, and once you are done, it pretty much turns into a assembly line. You can make a lot of different variations of the video. However, it's extremely time requiring. So even if you want to make a single animation, expect to spend like 40 hours on it. That's my personal experience. After you have the first one ready, the subsequent ones are faster. And then we go to AI. Personally, I got into the world of AI last year, some 4 months ago, with the launch of DALL-E 3. I had already used Stable Diffusion 1.5 a lot, and I still use Stable Diffusion 1.5, especially for their LGSR upscaling model, which I can't seem to find anywhere else, and apparently doesn't run with Comfy UI. So I still use it on Automatic 1111 or Automatic 1111, I think that's how people call it. But I saw a great opportunity because for the first time DALL-E 3 and a generative image model could create anatomically correct images. So that was the first time I could ask for a lung and get something that really resembled a lung. And so I saw a great opportunity there. And the most important thing to understand about AI is that it's easy to learn and fast to use. So it's something even someone with no experience can easily get into, and by tomorrow they will be creating decent images. However, it generates less accurate depictions, poor results for specific topics, and it's good for art, not so much for teaching. So I'd like to go through some examples here. But these examples might be great for a standalone video. So if you are interested, check the link here on the screen to our next video on AI problems and workarounds. And this video is sponsored by myself. You can also buy Betânio Martins products and clothing on our store, including my original images. So that's a great way for you to support my channel and to show your appreciation for medicine and anatomy.